Welcome to our deep dive into the history of madness. We have a really fascinating collection of sources to work with today.
I hope you do.
Excerpts from Roy Porter's Madness, a brief history, some historical images, and even some first-hand accounts.
Yeah.
It's going to be quite a journey as we try to uncover how different cultures have viewed and treated what we now call mental illness.
It is. And it's really quite amazing to see how these perceptions of madness have evolved over time and how intertwined they are with societal norms, religious beliefs, and even artistic expressions. We'll be traversing a vast historical landscape, from ancient civilizations to the dawn of modern psychiatry.
So let's start with those ancient civilizations. It seems they had a very different understanding of what caused madness.
If you can imagine living in ancient Assyria, Egypt, or archaic Greece, if someone was acting strangely, people wouldn't necessarily jump to a medical explanation.
Right.
They might believe that person was possessed by gods or demons.
So instead of doctors, you might call upon a priest or a shaman.
Exactly. Treatment involved rituals, sacrifices, and divination, all aimed at appeasing those supernatural forces. For them, madness wasn't a disease of the body. It was a spiritual or religious phenomenon.
That's such a different mindset than our own. But even in ancient times, we start to see a shift in thinking, don't we? Especially with the ancient Greeks.
The Greeks, particularly philosophers like Socrates and Plato, began to focus on the concept of the psyche.
Right.
They dissected it into reason, spirit, passions, and the soul, paving the way for the idea of man as a rational being.
Okay.
And this emphasis on reason created a stark contrast with the perceived irrationality of madness.
So madness was no longer just about being possessed by spirits.
Right.
It was about a disruption of reason.
Precisely.
A loss of that defining human quality.
And this shift in thinking paved the way for a more naturalistic approach to health and illness,
Yeah.
which we see with Hippocrates.
Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, right? I remember learning about his theory of the four humors. Wasn't he the one who said that an imbalance of these humors could cause all sorts of ailments?
That's right. Hippocrates believed that the body was a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm of the universe.
Right.
And he theorized that imbalances in those essential fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, could lead to various illnesses, including mental disorders.
So if you had an excess of blood or yellow bile, you might be considered manic, while too much black bile could lead to melancholy.
Right.
It seems so simplistic now.
It does.
But it was a revolutionary idea for its time, wasn't it?
It certainly was.
Yeah.
While the specifics might seem outdated to us, what's crucial is that Hippocrates shifted the focus from the supernatural to the natural world. He sought explanations within the body itself, laying the groundwork for a more scientific approach to understanding health and disease.
And it was a system, a way of categorizing and understanding different mental states. Did this theory of the humors have a lasting impact on Western thought?
Absolutely. Hippocratic medicine had a profound influence on Western medical thinking for centuries. It provided a framework for understanding and classifying mental illness, even if the details were eventually proven incorrect.
But it wasn't just about theory. The Greeks were also keen observers of the human body and mind, weren't they?
You're thinking of physicians like Erickson,
Yeah.
whose detailed observations of mental illnesses were remarkably similar to modern diagnoses.
Right.
He described conditions that sound very much like what we now call manic depressive psychosis, with detailed descriptions of symptoms and behaviors.
It's incredible to think that ancient physicians were already recognizing these complex patterns of mental distress. What kinds of treatments did they use? Did they move beyond rituals and sacrifices?
They did. Interestingly, some of their therapies resonate with modern approaches. They incorporated talk therapy, adjustments to diet and exercise, and even utilized substances like opium for their medicinal properties.
So it's not just about bloodletting and purging like we see in later centuries.
Not entirely. While those practices did persist, the Greeks recognized the importance of a holistic approach, considering both the physical and mental aspects of well-being.
It seems like the Greeks were really pushing the boundaries of understanding the human mind. But what happened to these ideas with the rise of Christianity and the Middle Ages? Did we see a return to those supernatural explanations?
With the rise of Christianity, perceptions of madness took a decidedly different turn. The focus shifted back to the supernatural, with a strong emphasis on the battle between good and evil.
So instead of imbalances and humors, we're back to demons and possession.
Yes, but with a Christian twist. The idea of psychomacy, The internal struggle within the psyche between God and the devil became a dominant theme. It wasn't just about external forces, it was about the soul's salvation.
And this concept of spiritual warfare had a huge impact on how madness was viewed and treated, right?
Absolutely. Treatment focused on spiritual remedies. Catholics might seek solace in masses, exorcisms, and pilgrimages to sacred sites, like Geel in the Netherlands, known for its healing powers for the insane.
And what about Protestants? Did they follow a similar path?
Protestants, with their emphasis on individual faith and scripture, turned to intense prayer and Bible study as ways to combat spiritual affliction.
Right.
The perceived cause of madness might have differed from ancient times, but the reliance on spiritual intervention remained strong.
It's fascinating how these beliefs shaped the way people experienced and responded to mental distress. But even during the Middle Ages, there were glimmers of skepticism towards those demoniacal diagnoses, weren't there?
Yes, cracks began to appear in the dominant narrative. Physicians like Johannes Weyer started to question the prevailing belief in witchcraft as the cause of madness, suggesting that some behaviors attributed to demonic possession might have medical explanations.
So we're starting to see the seeds of a more scientific approach reemerging.
Exactly. Another physician, Edward Jordan, even went so far as to describe a medical condition called suffocation of the mother.
Wow.
That could mimic the symptoms of demonic possession. He argued that what appeared to be spiritual affliction could actually be rooted in physical ailments.
It sounds like physicians were starting to reclaim some authority in the realm of mental illness, challenging the dominance of religious explanations.
They were. And this shift in thinking gained momentum with the Enlightenment, a period that championed reason and scientific inquiry. Religious extremism came under fire for its social and political consequences, and even enthusiasm, excessive religious fervor, began to be viewed through a medical lens.
So we're seeing a move away from those spiritual interpretations toward a more secular understanding of madness.
Precisely. Thinkers like Thomas Willis and Erasmus Darwin, yes, Charles Darwin's grandfather, started to categorize religious frenzy as a brain-based illness, suggesting it was caused by bodily imbalances or nervous disorders. This directly challenged the religious model of madness.
And figures like Voltaire and Diderot went even further, suggesting that Christian beliefs themselves were a product of sick brains. That's quite a statement for the time.
It reflects the changing intellectual landscape of the Enlightenment. Madness was increasingly being viewed as a medical problem, a disorder within the body and brain rather than a spiritual affliction.
It sounds like this was a major turning point in the history of madness, setting the stage for the rise of psychiatry and the asylum. But before we get to that, there's another fascinating aspect to explore: the enduring image of the fool.
Yes, the fool, a figure that has fascinated and perplexed societies for centuries. It's a complex image, often associated with madness, but not always entirely negative.
It seems like the fool embodies this strange mix of fear, mockery, and a hint of respect. Sometimes they even possess a kind of hidden wisdom.
Exactly. The fool, the jester, the madman, they all occupy this liminal space both inside and outside of society.
Right.
They're often marginalized, but their unique perspective, their ability to see the world differently, can be both unsettling and insightful.
We see this in literature, don't we? Shakespeare's fools often have the most profound lines, speaking truth to power and exposing the absurdity of the world around them.
They do. And think about the concept of the melancholy genius. From ancient Greece to the Renaissance, there was this belief that melancholy, a state often associated with madness, could fuel creativity and intellectual brilliance. Aristotle even suggested that all outstanding men were melancholic.
And poets like Kit Marlowe were praised for their fine madness. It's a far cry from the image of the madman as a dangerous outcast.
It is. But then you have places like Bethlehem Hospital, the infamous Bedlam, which becomes a spectacle, a place where the insane are on display for public amusement.
It's almost like a morbid tourist attraction. The insane become objects of both fear and fascination, their suffering turned into entertainment.
Bethlehem represents a turning point. It's a space where the boundaries between confinement and spectacle, between medical observation and social control, become blurred. And this blurring continues as we move into the 18th and 19th centuries.
That's when the concept of nervous disorders starts to emerge, right? What was behind that shift?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Nervous disorders become almost fashionable among the elite, a sign of sensitivity and intelligence. Works like George Chain's The English Malady link melancholy to the stresses of modern life, the pressures of success and ambition.
So instead of being possessed by demons or simply being a fool, you might be considered a bit nervous, a sign that you're overworked and overstimulated.
Precisely. It was a way of medicalizing those anxieties, of framing them as a product of modern life rather than a moral failing. And this new understanding of mental distress becomes a topic of social discourse, something to be debated and analyzed by figures like James Boswell and Samuel Johnson.
But then, in the Victorian era, things take another turn. Mental illness becomes increasingly associated with women, particularly through the trope of the hysterical female.
It's a complex and troubling development reflecting deep-seated anxieties about female sexuality and emancipation. Think about the characters in Gothic novels, figures like Ophelia, even Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre. They all embody this image of the unstable, irrational woman, driven mad by her repressed desires and societal constraints.
It seems like a way of pathologizing female behavior, of using medical language to control and silence women who are challenging traditional roles.
It was. And it's a stark reminder that our understanding of madness is always shaped by the social and cultural context in which it emerges. What we see as madness often reflects our own anxieties and fears about those who are different, those who don't fit neatly into societal norms.
It's a powerful reminder that the history of madness is not just about medical theories and treatments.
Right.
It's about the power dynamics, the social structures, and the cultural beliefs that shape how we view and respond to mental distress. And this leads us to another major development, the rise of the asylum.
Yes, the asylum, a space that embodied both hope and despair, both the promise of cure and the reality of confinement.
It's a complex story that deserves its own deep dive. Maybe that's where we should pick up in part 2.
I think that's a perfect place to pause. We've covered a lot of ground, from ancient beliefs to the stirrings of modern psychiatry, but the journey through the history of madness has just begun.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the history of madness. Last time we were talking about the shift away from purely spiritual explanations for mental illness and the beginnings of a more scientific approach.
Yeah, that's right. And as we move into the 17th and 18th centuries, we see the rise of the mechanical philosophy, this idea that the universe and even the human body operates like a complex machine.
So instead of thinking about imbalances in humors, we're now looking at the body's physical parts, the organs, the nerves, the fibers, trying to figure out where things are going wrong.
Exactly. Thinkers like Thomas Willis, a real pioneer in neurology, were dissecting brains, mapping out the nervous system, and trying to locate the origins of madness within these physical structures.
It's like we're moving from the alchemist's lab to the anatomy theater. But didn't this emphasis on the physical body create a new problem for understanding mental illness? I mean, what about the mind itself?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that continues to challenge us even today. Descartes, the famous philosopher, really threw a wrench in things with his idea of mind-body dualism.
Yeah.
He argued that the mind and body were separate entities.
So how do you explain a sick mind if the mind is immaterial, distinct from the physical body?
Well, that was the dilemma. It created this real tension in how to understand and treat mental illness. Some physicians, like Richard Mead, tried to reconcile these ideas by viewing the madman as a disordered machine.
Okay.
They focused on breakdowns in the sensory motor system, suggesting that even delirium, a state we often associate with mental disturbance, could be explained as a bodily distemper.
So even though Descartes had created this philosophical divide, physicians were still trying to ground madness in the physical realm.
It was a way of asserting the authority of medicine, of saying, we can treat this. It's not just about spirits or moral failings. And it also helped to lessen the stigma for patients. You're no longer a lost soul or a moral degenerate. You're simply a machine in need of repair.
It makes sense. But even if you can explain some symptoms as physical malfunctions, what about the more subtle aspects of mental illness, things like delusions, hallucinations, disordered thoughts?
That's where John Locke's philosophy of mind comes in. He emphasized the importance of sensory experiences and the association of ideas. Instead of focusing solely on the physical mechanics of the body, he was interested in how the mind itself worked, how it processed information and formed beliefs.
So we're shifting from a purely mechanical model to one that's more focused on the mind's inner workings.
Right. Thinkers like Thomas Arnold and Alexander Crichton start to apply Lockean psychology to understand and classify mental disorders. They're trying to create a system that accounts for both the physical and mental aspects of illness.
It's like we're starting to see the early foundations of psychology as a distinct field of study. And these new ideas about the mind were also influencing how mental illness was treated, weren't they?
Absolutely. By the late 18th century, you see this fascinating convergence of psychological thinking and the practical realities of asylum management. It leads to the development of moral therapy.
Moral therapy. What did that involve? It sounds a bit like a philosophy class rather than a medical treatment.
Well, it was a bit of both, actually. Thinkers like Vincenzo Chirughi in Italy and Philippe Pinel in France, who were both working within asylums, advocated for a more humane and respectful approach to treatment. They emphasized the importance of moral control, not in a punitive sense, but rather in terms of creating a structured and supportive environment that could help patients regain their reason and self-control.
It's a move away from physical restraints and punishments toward a more therapeutic approach, one that recognizes the patient's humanity and their capacity for healing.
Exactly. And it's a fascinating blend of the psychological and the social. They were creating therapeutic communities within the asylum places where patients could engage in meaningful activities, interact with each other, and develop healthy relationships.
It sounds like a precursor to modern therapeutic communities and group therapy. Did these ideas catch on? Did they have a lasting impact on the treatment of mental illness?
They did. And they were especially influential in the 19th century, which saw the rise of psychiatry as a distinct medical specialty. The asylum becomes a central stage for this emerging field, a place where doctors are observing patients, developing classifications, and experimenting with new treatments.
And different countries were taking slightly different approaches, weren't they?
They were. In France, for example, Jean-Étienne Dominique Esquirol, a student of Pinel's, really emphasized clinical observation and the detailed classification of mental illnesses. He was instrumental in establishing psychiatry as a recognized medical field, and his work laid the groundwork for the diagnostic manuals we use today.
And what about Germany? Weren't they really focused on the connection between mental illness and brain pathology?
Yes, German psychiatry was taking a different path, one that emphasized the biological underpinnings of mental illness. Wilhelm Grasinger, a prominent German psychiatrist, argued that mental disorders were fundamentally diseases of the brain, and he advocated for a close alliance between psychiatry and neurology.
It's the birth of what we might call biological psychiatry today. Were there any particular theories or ideas that were driving this approach?
One that really captured the imagination of the time was degeneration theory. It was this idea that mental illness, criminality, and other forms of deviance were all signs of a hereditary decline, a step backward on the evolutionary ladder.
It sounds a bit like a Victorian version of eugenics. Were there any specific figures associated with this theory?
Benedict Augustin Morel, a French psychiatrist, was one of the key figures in developing degeneration theory. He argued that mental illness was a progressive and irreversible deterioration of the nervous system passed down through generations.
It's a rather pessimistic view of mental illness, suggesting that it's not only incurable, but also a threat to the future of society.
It was a reflection of the anxieties of the time. There was this fear of social decline, of moral decay, and degeneration theory offered a way to explain and categorize these fears. And this wasn't just happening in Europe.
You're talking about the U.S. and the rise of neurasthenia.
Exactly. Neurasthenia, sometimes called American nervousness, was seen as a distinctly modern ailment, a product of the stresses and strains of industrial society.
So instead of demonic possession or imbalances in humors, we're now blaming the telegraph and the railroad.
In a way, yes. George Beard, an American neurologist, argued that the rapid pace of life, the constant stimulation, and the pressures of achievement in American society were overwhelming people's nervous systems, leading to a wide range of symptoms: fatigue, anxiety, insomnia, headaches, indigestion, the list goes on.
It sounds like a 19th century version of burnout. And how did they treat this American nervousness?
Silas Weir Mitchell, another prominent American neurologist, developed a rest cure for neurasthenia, which became quite popular among the upper classes.
Okay.
It involved prolonged bed rest, isolation from the outside world, and a strict diet, all aimed at restoring the depleted nervous system.
It sounds a bit like a luxurious form of solitary confinement. But it's interesting how mental illness, in this case neurasthenia, becomes linked to cultural values and societal anxieties.
It always does. And as psychiatry solidified as a field, it started to play a more prominent role in society, particularly in the legal system.
You're talking about the insanity defense.
Yes, psychiatrists were increasingly called upon to assess criminal responsibility, to determine whether a defendant was insane at the time of the crime. The Umnaughton Rules, established in England in 1844, became the key legal precedent, defining insanity in terms of the defendant's ability to distinguish right from wrong.
It's a tricky area, fraught with ethical and legal complexities, and it highlights the growing influence of psychiatry on how we understand human behavior and its consequences.
It does. And by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the field of psychiatry was a real melting pot of ideas. You have those pushing for biological explanations, others focusing on psychological factors, and still others emphasizing the role of social and environmental influences. It was a period of tremendous intellectual ferment, and it laid the groundwork for some of the major developments that would shape the 20th century, particularly the rise of psychoanalysis.
Ah, yes, Freud and the talking cure. But before we delve into that fascinating chapter, maybe we should shift our focus for a moment. We've been talking a lot about the theories and treatments, but what about the people who are ever from these grand narratives?
You're absolutely right. It's crucial to remember that the history of madness is not just about medical theories and institutions. It's about the lived experiences of individuals who were deemed different, who were often silenced and marginalized.
So let's shift our perspective for a moment. Let's try to understand what it was like to be on the receiving end of these diagnoses and treatments, to be labeled as mad in a world that often didn't understand or even care to listen. Welcome back to our deep dive into the history of madness. We've covered a lot of ground, from ancient beliefs to the rise of the asylum and the beginnings of modern psychiatry. But as we ended part 2, I think it's important to shift our focus a little bit to talk more about the voices of the people who were labeled as mad.
Yes, absolutely, and whose experiences were often overshadowed by those medical theories and institutional practices that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the big picture, but ultimately this is about human lives, right? Individual stories of suffering and resilience.
Exactly. And access to the inner world of those labeled mentally ill, well, it can be challenging. Their perspectives might challenge our conventional notions of reality, and it can be tempting to dismiss their experiences as meaningless or simply symptoms of a disordered mind.
Right, but that dismissal speaks volumes, doesn't it, about who gets to decide what's normal and who is then labeled as sick.
Precisely. And this was a central critique of the anti-psychiatry movement that emerged in the 20th century.
Right.
Figures like R.D. Laing argued that mental illness wasn't simply a biological malfunction, but often a meaningful response to societal pressures, family dynamics, and existential dilemmas.
So instead of just trying to fix the individual, they were looking at the broader context, the social and cultural forces that might be contributing to mental distress.
Right. They were challenging the idea that madness was simply something to be controlled and contained, and they were advocating for a more humane and understanding approach to mental health care, one that recognized the individual's agency and their capacity for healing.
And this idea of listening to the voices of the mad is a powerful one, but also a complex one. How do we access those experiences, especially when they might be expressed in ways that are hard for us to understand?
Well, it requires a willingness to step outside of our own assumptions, to really listen without judgment or preconceived notions. Take James Tilly Matthews, for example. He was confined to Bethlehem Hospital in the late 18th century for his very elaborate delusions about being targeted by a group of magnetic spies who were controlling his thoughts with a machine called the heirloom.
Wow.
His physician, John Haslam, meticulously documented Matthews' experiences in his book Illustrations of Madness, but it's clear that he viewed them as symptoms of a disordered mind, not a coherent worldview.
Yeah, it's like they're speaking two different languages. Matthews is trying to express his reality, but Haslam is interpreting it through the lens of medical diagnosis.
And this disconnect between the patient's experience and the doctor's interpretation, well, it was a common theme. John Percival, a former asylum patient who wrote so eloquently about his own experiences, criticized this lack of communication and empathy. He argued that this refusal to truly engage with his experiences, to see them as anything more than symptoms, actually hindered his recovery.
It's a reminder that even in institutions that claim to be therapeutic, there is often this element of dehumanization, this focus on control and management rather than genuine understanding.
And this silencing of the insane continues throughout history. Think about the autobiography of James Tilly Matthews that I mentioned earlier. He describes being tormented by a gang of 7 who used these elaborate machines to control his thoughts and emotions. It's easy to dismiss his account as pure delusion, But it also speaks to the powerlessness he felt within the asylum system, his inability to control his own destiny.
Right. It's like his delusions are a way of making sense of his confinement, of explaining the forces that he feels are acting upon him.
Exactly. And Clifford Beers, whose book A Mind That Found Itself exposed the harsh realities of asylum life and became a catalyst for the mental hygiene movement, had a similar experience. He felt that his experiences were dismissed and misunderstood by those in power.
Yeah. It's a powerful testament to the importance of patient voices, of sharing those lived experiences, and challenging the systems that perpetuate stigma and mistreatment.
It is. And it's not just modern-day patients whose experiences have been reinterpreted through a psychiatric lens. Think about Marjorie Kemp, a medieval mystic whose religious visions and ecstasies were often seen as signs of madness, even though they were deeply meaningful to her.
Right. It's a reminder that the boundaries between religious fervor and mental illness can be blurry.
Yep.
What we might see as a symptom today could have been viewed as a sign of divine inspiration in another time and place.
Precisely. And those categories are constantly evolving.
Yeah.
Take George Trost, for example. He attributed his experiences to both demonic possession and divine intervention, blurring the lines between religious and medical explanations. Or Jonathan Martin, who believed he was carrying out God's will when he set fire to York Minster.
Right. It's like we're constantly trying to categorize and explain human experience, but sometimes those categories just break down and we're left with these ambiguous, messy stories that defy easy explanation.
And that's where art comes in. The connection between art and madness has fascinated people for centuries. There's this enduring debate about the mad genius, the idea that creativity and mental instability are somehow linked.
Yeah.
And psychiatrists have even used art as a way to understand and treat mental illness. Figures like Hans Prinzhorn and Jean Dubuffet collected and exhibited the art of the insane, recognizing its unique expressive power.
It was a recognition that the mad have something valuable to contribute, that their experiences, even if they defy easy categorization, can be sources of insight and creativity.
And then, of course, we have the arrival of Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis at the turn of the 20th century.
Right.
Freud's theories revolutionized the way we think about the human mind. He emphasized the power of the unconscious, the influence of early childhood experiences, and the role of sexuality in shaping our thoughts and behaviors.
Yeah. It was a radical departure from previous theories, and it really shifted the focus inward towards those hidden desires, traumas, and conflicts that might be driving mental distress.
Exactly. And his techniques, things like free association and dream interpretation, were designed to access those hidden realms, to bring those unconscious conflicts to light and work through them.
Right. And psychoanalysis wasn't just confined to the therapist's couch. It had a huge impact on popular culture, influencing art, literature, and even our understanding of everyday life.
It became this lens through which to view human behavior, this way of interpreting everything from dreams to slips of the tongue.
But Freud's ideas were also controversial, particularly his emphasis on infantile sexuality, and his theories were constantly evolving, which led to debates and revisions within the field.
Yeah, figures like Alfred Adler and Carl Jung, who were initially part of Freud's inner circle, eventually broke away and developed their own variations of psychoanalytic theory.
So even within psychoanalysis, there's this diversity of thought, this ongoing debate about the nature of the human psyche.
And as psychoanalysis was gaining ground, the biological approach to mental illness was also experiencing a revival fueled by new discoveries in neurology, endocrinology, and pharmacology.
Yeah. It seems like we're always oscillating between these two poles, the psychological and the biological, in our attempts to understand mental illness.
It's a tension that continues to this day. And in the mid-20th century, this debate played out in some pretty dramatic ways with the introduction of treatments like insulin coma therapy, electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, and even psychosurgery, particularly lobotomy.
Right. These treatments were incredibly controversial both for their effectiveness and their ethical implications.
They were. They were often used on patients who couldn't consent, and the long-term consequences could be devastating.
Yeah, but then in the 1950s comes what's often called the psychopharmacological revolution, with the introduction of the first generation of antipsychotic and antidepressant drugs.
Yeah, it was a watershed moment.
Yeah.
These medications offered a new way to manage the symptoms of severe mental illness, and they really paved the way for deinstitutionalization, the movement to shift patients out of long-term hospitalization and into community-based care.
But deinstitutionalization, while well-intentioned, had its own challenges. Many patients were released without adequate support systems, and the promise of community care often fell short.
Right. It's a reminder that even with scientific advances, the social and ethical complexities of treating mental illness, they remain. And this is where the anti-psychiatry movement of the 1960s really comes into focus. They critiqued the medical model, arguing that it was too focused on diagnosis and control and not enough on understanding the individual's experience.
So it was back to that idea of listening to the voices of the mad, of challenging the power structures that define what's normal and what's pathological.
Exactly. Figures like R.D. Ling argued that mental distress was often a meaningful response to societal pressures, and that the label of madness was used to silence dissent and enforce conformity.
Wow. So by the end of the 20th century, you have this really complex and fragmented landscape. We've made incredible strides in understanding the brain and developing new treatments, but we're still grappling with those fundamental questions about the nature of madness, the role of society, and the ethics of care.
And those questions continue to challenge us in the 21st century. We have more sophisticated tools and treatments, but the mysteries of the mind remain. We're still searching for answers, still trying to make sense of the human experience in all its complexity and diversity.
Well, it's been an incredible journey through the history of madness, exploring the changing ways we viewed and treated mental illness. What strikes me is that it's not just a story of medical progress, but a reflection of our evolving understanding of ourselves and what it means to be human.
And that's perhaps the most important takeaway. Understanding mental illness is an ongoing process, a conversation that requires compassion, humility, and a willingness to listen to those who have lived the experience.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to continue exploring this fascinating and ever-evolving subject.